There comes a moment in life when everything you've hidden, from yourself, from the world, even from God, comes to the surface. Not as punishment, but as an invitation. An invitation to truly look. To see beyond the mask you wear every day. To perceive the inner truth that pulsates beneath your skin, silently screaming, "Wake up! You are so much more than this." Daniel thought he knew himself. He thought he was in control. That he was okay. Until the day he found an old camera in his deceased grandmother's attic, and everything crumbled. Because that wasn't an ordinary camera. It didn't just capture faces. It captured souls. It revealed hidden shadows. It showed invisible presences. And worst of all, it forced you to see yourself without filters, without lies, without disguises. And when Daniel finally pointed the lens at himself, he discovered something terrifying and liberating at the same time. He wasn't who he thought he was. This is the story of a man who photographed the invisible and discovered that the greatest mystery wasn't out there. It was within him. It's about spirituality, self-knowledge, forgiveness, and the most difficult journey anyone can take, the encounter with oneself. It's about understanding that life itself is a spiritual camera trying to show you something. And that the question isn't, "What do I see?" but rather, "Do I have the courage to look?" Get ready. Because what you're about to discover could forever change the way you see the world, people, and especially yourself. If this story touches your soul, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Because here, every story is an awakening. And the next one could be yours. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Daniel found the old camera in his grandmother's attic. Covered in dust, heavy, analog. One of those that nobody uses anymore. He laughed to himself, thinking about how the world had changed. But something about that object made him stop. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light hit the lenses. Or maybe it was the dense silence of that empty house, where his grandmother had left 3 months before without saying goodbye. Daniel held the camera, felt its weight in his hands, and without knowing why, began to cry. He hadn't cried since the funeral. He hadn't cried since life taught him that strong men don't shed tears, that deep feelings should be hidden, locked away, forgotten. But there, alone in that dusty attic, something inside him broke. The camera seemed to pulse between his fingers, as if it were alive. And then, in an inexplicable impulse, Daniel raised it and aimed at the fogged mirror on the wall. The sound echoed in the silence. And when he lowered the camera, he felt a shiver run down his spine, as if something invisible had been captured, something his eyes couldn't see, but his soul recognized perfectly. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The image of that moment in the attic kept replaying. The mirror, the camera, the click. And a strange, almost suffocating feeling that something had changed forever. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just tiredness, longing, unresolved grief. But deep down, very deep down, he knew that wasn't it. Something had been awakened. Something that had been dormant for years inside him was beginning to move, to pulsate, to demand attention. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt fear, not of what was out there, but of what he might discover within himself. Daniel spent the following days trying to forget that moment in the attic. He returned to his routine, to his work at the advertising agency, to the endless meetings, to the automatic smiles. But the damned camera wouldn't leave his head. He had taken it home, put it on a shelf, tried to ignore it. Until one Thursday, during lunch with his colleagues, something strange happened. While everyone laughed at some joke, Daniel looked at Marcelo, his best friend of 10 years, and saw something he had never seen before. It wasn't visible to the eye, but it was real, a heavy shadow around him, a deep sadness hidden behind that wide smile. And Daniel knew, he simply knew, that Marcelo was suffering in silence. That night he couldn't resist. He grabbed the camera, loaded a roll of unexposed film he found with it, and went out into the city streets. Each person who passed seemed to carry something invisible, layers of energy, unspoken emotions, hidden pains. A woman in the supermarket queue had her shoulders hunched by a weight no one saw. A man at the bus stop stared blankly into space with eyes full of regret. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, realized that everyone carries secret battles, wounds that the world ignores because it cannot see them. He raised his camera and began to photograph. Each shot seemed to capture not just faces, but entire souls. When he revealed the photos days later, Daniel almost fainted. They weren't just ordinary portraits. In each image there was something more. Figures, lights, shadows that shouldn't be there. In Marcelo's photo, a female silhouette touched his shoulder, as if consoling him. The woman from the market had invisible chains on her wrists. The man at the bus stop was surrounded by a dark, dense, suffocating fog. Daniel dropped the photos on the table, his hands trembling. This couldn't be possible. Or could it? What if that camera captured not only light, but also the spiritual truth of people? What if it revealed what consciousness hides, what the soul carries, what the heart cannot express? Daniel looked at his own hands and felt a lump in his throat. If the camera showed the truth of others, what would it show of himself? Daniel avoided the mirror for 3 days. He knew he needed to do it, point the camera at himself and finally see what was hidden in the depths of his own soul. But the fear was real, visceral, paralyzing. What if he saw something terrible? What if he discovered he was a monster disguised as an ordinary man? In the early hours of Sunday morning, he woke up sweating, his heart racing. He had dreamt of his grandmother, but she didn't speak, only pointed at the camera with a look that mixed compassion and urgency. Daniel got out of bed, walked to the still dimly lit living room, and picked up the camera with trembling hands. Now or never. He positioned himself in front of the large living room mirror, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and shot. The click sounded like thunder in the silence. Daniel slowly opened his eyes, but didn't dare look in the mirror. He put away the camera, dressed quickly, and left the house, running from himself as he had been doing for so long. During the following days, life went on, but he was different. More restless, more present, more aware of every thought, every feeling, every reaction. It was as if that undeveloped photograph pulsed within him, demanding attention, urging him to be brave. And then, on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He went to the photo lab, handed over the film with sweaty hands, and told the clerk he would return the next day. He left feeling like he had just sealed his own fate. When he picked up the envelope with the developed photos, Daniel sat on a park bench across from the lab and simply stood there, paralyzed, holding the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. The light rain dampened his face, but he didn't even notice. Finally, with a deep sigh that seemed to come from past lives, he opened it. The first photo was of him in the mirror. But he wasn't alone. Behind his image, semi-transparent but undeniably present, was a shadowy figure, hunched over, hands covering his face. It was himself, or rather, it was everything he had locked away deep in his soul for years. The anger never expressed. The hurt never healed. The wounded boy he never let cry. Daniel felt the tears welling up, and for the first time, he didn't hold them back. Because he understood at that moment that you can't escape your own shadow. It goes with you wherever you go, until you finally have the courage to turn on the light. Daniel spent the following week obsessed. The camera wasn't just an object. It was a bridge between worlds, a portal that revealed layers of existence most people would never see. He began researching, delving into old books on spirituality, on spiritual photography, on how certain objects can capture invisible energies. He discovered accounts of cameras that photographed spirits, of lenses that revealed auras, of films sensitive to the vibration of the soul. And everything made sense now. That camera of his grandmother's wasn't ordinary. She had used it for decades to record spiritual encounters, mediumistic sessions, sacred moments. It was a tool of light, an instrument that didn't lie, didn't disguise, didn't hide. And now it was in his hands, the skeptical grandson who had always laughed at his grandmother's beliefs. One morning, while having coffee alone in the kitchen, Daniel had a devastating revelation. Every time he looked at someone with that camera, it wasn't the lens capturing the truth, it was his own conscience awakening. The camera was just a mirror, an excuse for him to finally pay attention to what had always been there. People always carried their shadows, their pain, their hidden lights. But he had never truly looked. He lived in an automatic, superficial, empty rush. And now, with that instrument in his hands, he was forced to see, really see the invisible depth of every human being, including himself. It was as if the camera was saying, "Look beyond the mask. See the soul." That afternoon, Daniel walked through the streets with his camera hanging around his neck and a lighter heart. He didn't photograph anyone, he simply observed. He looked into the eyes of a child in the park and saw pure innocence. He looked at an elderly couple holding hands and saw decades of love, arguments, forgiveness, and new beginnings. He looked at a beggar on the corner and saw dignity, wisdom, and a spiritual light that many rich people would never possess. He no longer needed the camera to see, it had done its job. It had awakened in him the gift that everyone possesses but few activate, the ability to photograph souls with the heart. And as he walked back home, Daniel smiled for the first time in months. Because he understood that the true lens has always been love. And when you look at the world with love, even the invisible becomes visible. Daniel returned home that afternoon with an unsettling certainty hammering in his chest. If the camera revealed people's truth, then it had also revealed his. And that hunched shadow in the photo, that suffering being behind his image, was not an enemy. It was himself crying for help. It was every time he swallowed harsh words, every time he pretended to be okay, every time he betrayed his own feelings to please others. It was the boy who was beaten by his father and never cried. It was the young man who lost his girlfriend and pretended it didn't hurt. It was the adult who buried his grandmother without telling her how much he loved her. And now, faced with that photo, there was nowhere left to run. Either he forgave himself, or he would spend the rest of his life carrying that invisible weight. He sat on the living room floor, the photo in his hands, and for the first time in decades spoke aloud to himself. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm sorry for not listening to you. For ignoring you. For locking you away in secret while pretending everything was all right." The tears came uninvited, hot, liberating, washing away years of accumulated pain. Daniel cried like he hadn't cried since childhood, with deep sobs, with his whole body, with his whole soul. And with each tear that fell, he felt something loosening inside him, like invisible chains breaking one by one. Forgiveness didn't come like a ray of celestial light. It came slowly, painfully real. It came in the form of acceptance. Accepting that he was wrong, that he hurt himself, that he was unfair to himself. And that it was okay. That he was human. That he could start over. When the tears finally subsided, Daniel looked at the photo again. The shadow was still there, but now it seemed less heavy, less curved, almost translucent. Or perhaps it was just his imagination. Or perhaps not. He carefully kept the photo, like someone guarding a sacred relic, and felt a strange, new, unknown peace. It was as if a river that had been dammed up inside him had finally found the sea. Forgiveness is this, he thought. It's not forgetting what happened. It's letting go of what's already passed. It's releasing the weight, opening your hand, taking a deep breath and saying, "I deserve peace." And at that moment, Daniel knew that something had changed forever. Because when you forgive yourself, your whole life changes frequency. And what was once prison is now freedom. In the following days, Daniel realized something extraordinary. The shadow hadn't disappeared, and it didn't need to. He had spent his entire life believing that spirituality meant being pure light, absolute goodness, unwavering perfection. But the camera had shown another truth. Even the most enlightened people carry shadows. The difference lies in accepting them. In looking at your own wounds without judgment, without shame, without despair. One morning, while having coffee on the balcony, Daniel picked up the photo again and truly observed it. The shadow behind him wasn't a monster, it was a frightened child. It was the part of him that needed comfort, a listening ear, acceptance. And he finally understood, healing isn't about eliminating pain. It's about embracing it until it transforms into wisdom. He began to do something he had never done before, talk to his own emotions. When anger came, instead of swallowing it, he stopped and asked, "What are you trying to tell me?" When sadness tightened his chest, instead of distracting himself, he sat in silence and let it speak. And he discovered that each feeling carried a message, a lesson, a piece of inner truth that he had ignored for years. Anger said, "You deserve respect." Sadness said, "You need to rest." Fear said, "You are growing." And little by little, Daniel reconciled with all parts of himself, even those he swore never to look at again. Because acceptance is this. It's saying yes to everything you are, not just the beautiful parts. One afternoon, while watching the sunset through the window, Daniel had an insight that made him smile. Light only exists because shadow exists. Without contrast, there is no depth. Without night, there is no morning. Without pain, there is no healing. The camera hadn't revealed a flaw in him, it had revealed his complete humanity. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift. Because only those who accept their shadows can truly shine. Only those who embrace their wounds can transform them into wings. Daniel picked up the camera once more, aimed at the orange sunset sky, and shot. And he felt that this photo would capture not only the sky, but also the silent gratitude of a soul that had finally made peace with itself. And that, he knew, was only the beginning. It was on a Friday that everything changed again. Daniel was organizing his grandmother's things to donate when he found, at the bottom of a drawer, a yellowed envelope with his name handwritten on it. Inside, a short letter and an old photo, of him as a baby, in his grandmother's lap, both smiling. But it wasn't an ordinary photo. In the background, semi-transparent but undeniably present, was the figure of his grandfather, who had died 3 months before Daniel was born. His ghostly hands touched the baby's head in blessing. Daniel sat on the bed, his heart racing, and read the letter with trembling hands. "My beloved grandson, when you find this photo, I will already be gone. But I want you to know, love doesn't end with death. It only changes form. Your grandfather was present in every moment of your life, even without you knowing. And I will be too." The camera shows what the heart has always known: no one we love truly leaves. Daniel couldn't hold back the tears. Every time he felt an inexplicable presence beside him during difficult moments. Every time he had an intuition that saved him from wrong decisions. Every time he smelled a familiar scent with no apparent origin. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't coincidence. It was love crossing dimensions, breaking the barriers of the visible, whispering in the silence, "You were never alone." He picked up the old camera with renewed reverence and understood why his grandmother had left it to him. It wasn't just an object, it was a legacy. It was tangible proof that there is life beyond life, that spiritual energy doesn't fade, that true bonds are eternal. And he, the skeptic, the unbeliever, now held in his hands the evidence that would change everything. That night, Daniel went to the cemetery where his grandmother was buried. He knelt before the grave, camera to his chest, and simply gave thanks. He thanked her for every lesson he had ignored, for every story he thought was fantasy, for every time she had tried to awaken in him the divine consciousness that now pulsed with life. "Grandma," he said softly, "I finally understand. Love doesn't die. It only transforms." And then, on impulse, he raised the camera and photographed the grave in the moonlight. He didn't know what he would see when he developed it. But he wasn't afraid anymore either. Because now he knew that on the other side, somewhere beyond the veil, she was smiling. And his grandfather too. And all those he had loved and lost remained there, invisible to the eyes, but eternally present in his heart. And that, Daniel realized, was the greatest revelation of all. Daniel developed the cemetery photo on a gray Monday. When he opened the envelope in the lab parking lot, he had to lean on the car to avoid falling. There she was, his grandmother, transparent yet radiant, standing beside her own grave, smiling in that way only she knew how. And beside her, the grandfather Daniel never knew, his hand on her shoulder, both enveloped in a soft golden light, impossible to explain with known physics. But that wasn't all. Around them were other presences, faces Daniel recognized from old photos, relatives who had passed away before he was born, all gathered as if in a silent celebration. And then Daniel saw the detail that made him tremble. Near his grandmother's feet, a small sphere of light pulsed. And inside it he could make out something. Words. A message engraved in the very energy. Forgiveness liberates. Love remains. Continue. He got into the car, locked the doors, and wept desperately. Not from sadness, but from relief. From understanding. From liberation. All the guilt he carried for his grandmother's death, for not visiting more, for not saying, "I love you," enough, for being distant in recent years, all of that vanished in a single instant. Because she was saying, through that impossible photograph, that she was at peace. That she loved him. That there was never anything to forgive. Daniel rested his forehead on the steering wheel and finally understood what spirituality had been trying to teach for millennia. Emotions don't lie. When you feel the presence of someone who has passed, it's not an illusion. When your heart aches for no apparent reason, it's because a soul is trying to communicate. When you dream of someone who is gone, it's not just a memory, it's a visit. It's love crossing worlds. In the following days, Daniel began to pay attention to every emotion he felt. He discovered that the longing that tightened his chest on Sunday afternoons was his grandmother telling him she was nearby. He discovered that the inexplicable shiver he felt when listening to certain songs were memories of past lives asking for recognition. He discovered that the fear that paralyzed him was not cowardice, but his soul protecting him from wrong paths. Each feeling was a spiritual compass, a GPS of consciousness, a divine whisper. And the camera had only been the instrument for him to finally learn to read this sacred language. Daniel kept all the photos in a wooden box, along with his grandmother's letter, and knew he would never feel alone again. Because now he understood. The truth of emotions is the voice of the soul. And when you learn to listen to it, the invisible becomes more real than anything your eyes can see. Daniel woke up one morning with a suffocating certainty. One photo was still missing. The most important one. The most difficult. He had photographed strangers, he had photographed his grandmother in the cemetery, he had even photographed his own shadow. But he had never truly photographed himself. Without fear, without defenses, without masks. He got out of bed sweating, walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. His reflection in the mirror looked tired, aged, as if he had lived several years in those last few weeks. He picked up the camera that now lived by his side, positioned himself and simply breathed. "Who am I really?" he whispered to the mirror. Without the disguises. Without the lies. Without pretending. And then, with steady hands for the first time, he shot. The sound echoed in the silence of the early morning like a portal opening. He didn't wait to reveal it. He went straight to the 24-hour lab, paid for the express delivery, and waited outside like someone awaiting the results of a life-changing test. When the attendant called his name, Daniel went in, took the envelope, and opened it right there, under the cold light of the counter. The photo was of him in the mirror. But this time, there were no shadows, no ghostly figures. There was only him, but not the Daniel he knew. In the photo, his eyes shone with an intensity he had never seen in himself. Around his head, a soft, golden aura pulsed. And on his chest, right where his heart should be, a clear, strong, vibrant light radiated. He was seeing, for the first time, his own soul. Not the wounded version. Not the suffering version. But the pure, untouched, eternal essence. And it was beautiful. Daniel left the laboratory in a trance. He walked through the empty streets of the early morning with the photo in his hands, unable to stop looking at it. Who was that luminous being? That wasn't the weak man hiding from the world. It wasn't the wounded adult carrying traumas. It was something greater. Something that had always been there, beneath the layers of fear, pain, and denial. It was the inner truth he had spent his whole life trying to avoid, not because it was horrible, but because it was too grand to accept. Because recognizing one's own light is more frightening than facing the shadow. Because when you see who you really are, you can no longer pretend to be small. He sat on a park bench, looked at the starry sky, and whispered, "I am this. I have always been this." And for the first time in his life, Daniel saw himself without disguises, and he wasn't afraid. He felt reverence. Daniel didn't go to work that Monday. Nor Tuesday. Nor Wednesday. He asked for a week off and simply stayed home, looking at the photos scattered across the living room table as if they were pieces of a cosmic puzzle. Each image told a part of the story: the shadow, forgiveness, eternal love, inner revelation. And now, seeing it all together, he finally saw the complete picture. It wasn't about the camera. It never was. The camera was just a mirror. A trigger. A gift from his grandmother to force him to wake up. Because some people spend their whole lives asleep, living on autopilot, repeating patterns without questioning. And he had been one of those people, until that old object came into his hands and blew everything up. Now, awake, conscious, he could no longer go back to being who he was. And he didn't want to. He began to notice subtle but profound changes. When people spoke, he didn't just hear the words. He felt the emotions behind them. When he walked the streets, he didn't just see bodies. He saw energies, intentions, vibrations. A coworker who had always seemed confident now revealed a silent anguish that no one else noticed. An elderly neighbor he barely knew had such an intense light that he had to look away. Daniel hadn't become a psychic. He had simply awakened to what had always been there, but which most choose to ignore. The spiritual world is not separate from the physical. They coexist, intertwine, dance together in an invisible symphony that few can hear. And now he heard. He saw. He felt. He was completely awake. That Friday, Daniel returned to his grandmother's attic. He placed the camera exactly where he had found it, on the same dusty shelf, next to old books on spirituality that he now intended to read. He didn't need it anymore. It had served its purpose. But before leaving, he stopped at the door, looked back and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma, for everything." And then he felt a gentle breeze that shouldn't be there, carrying the unmistakable scent of jasmine that his grandmother always wore. He smiled, tears in his eyes, and understood the final lesson. Spiritual awakening is not a destination. It's a path that never ends. Because the more you awaken, the more you realize how much there is still to discover. And that, far from being frightening, was the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. Life finally made sense. And he was ready to truly live it. Weeks later, Daniel was in a bookstore when he found an old book on spiritual symbolism. He absent-mindedly leafed through it until he stopped at a page that discussed instruments of vision: telescopes, mirrors, crystals, cameras. The text said something that made him freeze. Every tool that amplifies human vision is, in fact, a metaphor for expanded consciousness. The lens doesn't create what we see, it only reveals what has always been there. Daniel closed the book slowly, his heart racing. Of course. His grandmother's camera never had magical powers. It was just an object. But by using it, he was forced to look, really look, beyond appearances. And this simple act of focusing, framing, and capturing had actually been a disguised spiritual exercise. Each click was an act of mindfulness. Each photo, a meditation. Each revelation, a mirror of his own awakening consciousness. He began to notice the same pattern in everything. When you truly pay attention to a flower, it ceases to be just decoration and becomes a miracle. When you truly listen to someone, that person ceases to be a character and becomes a universe. When you truly look at yourself, you cease to be just ego and become soul. The camera had only been the pretext for him to practice something humanity has forgotten: the art of seeing with the heart. And now, without it, Daniel continued photographing, not with his hands, but with his presence. Each moment lived with full awareness was an eternal photograph engraved in the memory of his soul. Each deep conversation was a spiritual portrait. Each sunset observed in silence was a divine click. He finally understood, we don't need special cameras to see the invisible. We just need to wake up. Daniel left the bookstore with the book under his arm and a radiant certainty in his heart. The camera had only been the teacher. But the lesson was eternal. Consciousness is the true lens. When you live distracted on autopilot, you only see surfaces, bodies, objects, appearances. But when you live awake, present, conscious, the whole world changes. You see layers. Invisible connections. You see that the stranger on the street is fighting the same internal battle as you. You see that the tree in the park is not just wood, but pulsating life connected to everything. You see that you yourself are not just flesh and bone, but eternal light disguised as a human. And this expanded vision, this awakened gaze, was the grandmother's true legacy. Not the camera, but the reminder that we all have internal lenses waiting to be cleaned, adjusted, focused. And when that happens, the whole of life reveals itself in high spiritual definition. It was on a Sunday afternoon, while walking through the park, that Daniel witnessed something that cemented everything. A child, no more than 5 years old, was sitting alone on a bench, staring blankly into the void beside her. Daniel was about to walk past when he heard the girl laughing. A pure, spontaneous laugh, as if someone had told the best joke in the world. But there was no one there. Or was there? He stopped, observed. The child stretched out her hand as if holding invisible fingers, and said aloud, "Grandpa, you're funny." Daniel felt a shiver run through his entire body. That little girl was seeing something he didn't see. Or rather, she hadn't yet learned to ignore what was real. While the adults passed by distracted, engrossed in their cell phones and their worries, that child interacted with a dimension that most had forgotten existed. And Daniel knew, in that instant, that the invisible is not absence. It's just a different frequency. He sat down on another bench, discreetly, and continued observing. The girl's mother arrived a few minutes later, calling her to leave. The child waved to the empty space, said, "Bye, Grandpa, I love you," and skipped away. The mother didn't even notice. She was busy answering messages. Daniel sat there alone, looking at that empty space which, in truth, wasn't empty at all. How many presences passed by him every day without him noticing? How many deceased loved ones silently accompanied their families, invisible but present? How many energies, spirits, disembodied consciousnesses inhabited the same space as him, only vibrating in another dimension? And he, who before would have called this madness, now knew it was spiritual science. Because what the eyes don't see, the heart feels. And the heart never lies. Daniel returned home with a strange feeling of fullness. He called Marcelo, that friend he had seen carrying a heavy shadow, and simply asked, "How are you really?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then Marcelo broke down. He spoke of the depression he hid, the crumbling marriage, the urge to give up that haunted him in the early hours of the morning. And Daniel simply listened, really listened, without judging, without interrupting, without offering cheap solutions. He was simply present. Because he had learned that sometimes the greatest proof of love is seeing the invisible in the pain of another. It is validating what cannot be seen, but which is as real as any physical wound. When he hung up, hours later, he knew he had saved a life. Not with magic words, but with conscious presence. With the ability to see beyond. And he understood that this was the true purpose of the camera, to teach him to see that the invisible has always been the most real part of everything. Daniel began to notice a disturbing pattern. Nothing in his life had been a coincidence. His grandmother's death just when he was at his lowest emotional point. The camera found at the exact moment he most needed answers. Even that day in the park, witnessing the child talking to his invisible grandfather. Everything seemed orchestrated by a superior intelligence, as if the universe were conspiring to awaken him. On a rainy Thursday, while organizing old papers, he found his teenage diary. He opened it to a random page and read, "Sometimes I feel like I don't know who I really am. It's like I'm living someone else's life." He had written that when he was 15. And now, 20 years later, the universe had finally answered. Not with words, but with experiences that forced him to look inward. The call of self-knowledge is not gentle. It's insistent. It knocks on the door until you answer. He began to notice other coincidences that had always been there. That song that played every time he thought of his grandmother. That number that appeared repeatedly, 1111, 2222, always at moments of important decision. Those improbable encounters with people who said exactly what he needed to hear, even without knowing it. Daniel realized that his entire life had been a series of invitations to awakening. But he, like most, had always ignored them. He called it luck, bad luck, chance. Until the invitation became impossible to ignore in the form of an old camera that photographed souls. And now, finally awake, he saw the signs in everything. In the flight of a bird that crossed his path in moments of doubt. In the phrase from a book that opened to a random page and answered his question. in the stranger who smiled on the subway as if he knew him from other lives. Life spoke. All the time. He just needed spiritual ears to hear. That night, Daniel did something he had never done before. He lit a candle, sat silently on the living room floor, and simply asked aloud, "What else do I need to learn?" And he stayed there, silently, waiting. No celestial voice came. No mystical vision. But something deeper came, a feeling. A gentle, yet unwavering certainty that settled in his chest like an anchor of light. The answer was simple: keep looking. Keep feeling. Keep being true. Self-knowledge was not a destination to be reached. It was a daily journey of brutal honesty with oneself. Of looking at one's own patterns and asking, "Why do I do this?" Of feeling emotions without judgment and asking, "What are you trying to teach me?" Of living each day as if it were a sacred lesson disguised as routine. Daniel blew out the candle, lay down on the living room floor, and smiled in the dark. Because he had finally answered the call. And on the other side, in the invisible world, he knew that his grandmother was smiling too. Daniel was reviewing all the photos one Saturday morning when he noticed something extraordinary. The most luminous images were precisely those of the people who had suffered the most. The beggar on the street had an impressive golden aura. The woman at the market, even with invisible chains on her wrists, emanated a light from her chest that seemed like an inner sun. Even Marcelo, who carried that heavy shadow, had a brightness around his heart, as if the pain he endured was, paradoxically, polishing his soul. Daniel remembered something his grandmother used to say, which he always thought was corny: "The stars only shine in the darkness." Now he understood. Pain wasn't punishment. It was alchemy. It was the fire that transforms coal into diamonds. Every wound carries a hidden light, but only those who have the courage to dive into it can find the treasure. He spent the following days examining his own scars with this new perspective. The rejection he suffered in adolescence had taught him empathy. Now he could recognize the pain of others from afar. The failure of his first job had made him humble and persistent. The loss of his grandmother, the most painful of all, had ripped him from his spiritual comfort zone and thrown him onto the path of awakening. Each wound had been a disguised door. Each fall, an impulse to fly higher. And he, who had spent years lamenting, blaming fate, feeling like a victim, now saw with crystal clarity: nothing happens to you, it happens for you. The universe doesn't punish. It teaches. And the deepest lessons always come wrapped in the paper of pain. Because only what truly hurts has enough power to awaken a sleeping soul. Daniel picked up that first photo, him in front of the mirror with his shadow curved behind him, and looked at it again. Now, with awakened eyes, he saw something he had missed before. Within that shadow were small points of light, like stars on a dark night. His pain wasn't just darkness. It was also potential. It was also wisdom in formation. It was also self-love wanting to be born. He kept the photo reverently and whispered to himself, "Thank you for every wound. Thank you for every tear. Thank you for every night I thought I couldn't bear it." Because he understood, finally, that light doesn't appear despite the pain. It appears because of it. And the most enlightened people he had photographed weren't those who never suffered. They were those who transformed suffering into compassion, anger into forgiveness, fear into courage. They were those who discovered the deepest truth of spirituality: the brightest light always is born in the heart of darkness. And that's not poetry. It's the physics of the soul. 3 months after finding the camera, Daniel returned to the attic one last time. Not to retrieve anything, but to leave something behind. He had written a long letter detailing everything he had learned, everything he had seen, everything he had become. And he left it beside the camera, along with all the photos he had taken, so that whoever came after could continue the journey. Because now he understood, the camera was never his. It was a conduit, a spiritual tool that went from soul to soul, awakening those who were ready to awaken. His mission there was accomplished. His grandmother had done her work. She had rescued him from the abyss of unconsciousness. Now it was his turn to pass the baton on. But before leaving, he picked up the camera one last time, looked through the lens without shooting, and whispered, "Forgiveness is the focus of the soul. Without it, everything is blurred. With it, everything is illuminated." That phrase had come out of nowhere, or from very far away, depending on how you look at things. But it was absolutely true. Daniel had spent months photographing souls, seeing shadows, revealing hidden lights. And in the end, all the photos told the same story: people trapped in unforgiven pain. Old grudges, resentments harbored, guilt gnawing at him from within. And he himself had been the greatest example of this. The shadow in the first photo wasn't a monster. It was simply the part of him that had never forgiven himself for being human, for making mistakes, for disappointing others, for not being perfect. And when he finally forgave himself, everything changed. The next photo showed less shadow. The third even less. Until, in the last one, there was only light. Because forgiveness is not weakness. It is the most powerful tool for inner healing that exists. It is the soul's focus button. And when you finally adjust it, your entire life enters high-definition spirituality. Daniel went down the attic stairs, closed the door carefully, and left his grandmother's house for the last time. He didn't look back. He didn't need to anymore. He carried everything with him, not in his hands, but in his heart. As he drove back home, the setting sun painted the sky with impossible oranges and pinks. And he understood the final lesson, the one the camera had taken months to reveal. Life itself is a photograph in progress. Each choice a pixel. Each emotion a color. Each forgiveness an adjustment of light. And in the end, when the shutter of existence finally closes, the image that remains is not of what you achieved, what you possessed, or how you looked. It's of how much you loved, how much you forgave, how much you allowed yourself to be true. Daniel smiled, tears of gratitude silently streaming down his face, and whispered to the universe, "Thank you for the revelation. I wasn't ready to see, but now I'm ready to live." And he continued driving, unhurried, knowing that each moment from then on would be a conscious choice to focus on the light. Because that, he finally learned, is what it truly means to be alive. Daniel put the camera away. But he never stopped taking pictures again. But now, he photographs with the eyes of the soul. With presence. With awakened consciousness. Because he understood that we don't need magic instruments to see the invisible, we just need the courage to remove the blindfolds we've placed on ourselves. The truth is this: you also have a spiritual camera. It's inside you right now, trying to show you something. Maybe it's a shadow you avoid looking at. Maybe it's a light you're afraid to acknowledge. Maybe it's the forgiveness you need to give, not to others, but to yourself. Because in the end, the greatest revelation isn't about what's wrong with you. It's about how much light is hidden beneath the wounds. So I ask you, with an open heart, what is your inner camera trying to show you? What emotion have you been ignoring? What pain have you been hiding? What truth about yourself do you not want to face? And most importantly, are you ready to truly look? Because life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It throws lessons at you anyway. The difference lies in who wakes up and who continues sleeping. Daniel woke up. And you? Leave a comment. What was the biggest revelation life has ever shown you? That moment when you truly saw yourself without disguises? Let's share our stories, because no one awakens alone. And if this narrative touched something within you, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share. Because every soul that awakens illuminates the path for others. The journey continues. And the next chapter could be your awakening. Until the next revelation.